At first glance, this find almost seems like it shouldn't fit. A human skeleton, close to 9,000 years old, turns up along the Columbia River in Washington state, and suddenly a very old story about America's past starts to look less settled than people assumed. The bones are ancient, older than the pyramids, older than written history in much of the world. But what caught attention wasn't only the age, it was the face. Or, more precisely, the way the skull seemed to look different from what many researchers thought they would see. That was the beginning of the Kennewick Man case, the individual many later came to call the Ancient One. When the remains were found in 1996 near Kennewick, scientists understood fairly quickly that this was no ordinary discovery. The skeleton was unusually complete, and radiocarbon dating placed it at roughly 8,400 to 9,200 years old. That alone would have made it important. What turned it into something much larger, though, was the sense that the bones might be telling a story no one was prepared for. Early interpretations of the skull led some researchers to use the term Caucasoid, which, even then, was a loaded and somewhat slippery label. It did not mean European in any clean, modern sense, but that distinction tended to get lost once the case moved beyond academic circles. And that is probably where much of the confusion took hold. A technical observation became a cultural flashpoint, and then a much bigger argument. Who was this man? Where did he belong? And had the history of the Americas been misunderstood from the start? There was, of course, a more cautious explanation. Human variation is messy. Ancient populations were not carbon copies of modern ones. Skull shape can suggest certain affinities, but it can also mislead, especially when the remains are this old. Even so, that didn't settle anything. The skeleton ended up sitting at the crossroads of science, identity, and law. Several Native American tribes viewed him as an ancestor and sought reburial under federal law, while some scientists argued the remains were too ancient and perhaps too unusual to link confidently to living communities. What made the case so difficult was that it never seemed to be just about one set of bones. It pointed to a larger discomfort inside archaeology itself, the possibility that the first peoples of the Americas were more varied and less easy to sort into tidy categories than textbooks once suggested. For years, Kennewick Man remained suspended in that uncertainty. And maybe that is why the case has stayed so compelling. Sometimes the first thing we think we see is not quite the truth. Sometimes bones suggest one story, while the deeper record, still hidden inside them, waits to complicate it. The broad outline of the story has usually seemed fairly clear. Most researchers think the first peoples of the Americas came from Northeast Asia, moving across Beringia when lower sea levels connected Siberia and Alaska, then gradually spreading south over many generations. The details have been revised over time, sure, but the basic idea has held up. The peopling of the Americas starts in the Northwest, not in Europe, and not through some lost Atlantic migration. By that logic, Kennewick Man ought to have fit somewhere within that early Native American past. But the case did not unfold so neatly. When the remains were first examined, the initial forensic impression pointed in a more confusing direction. James Chatters, the anthropologist who looked at the skeleton early on, thought the skull did not resemble what he would have expected from a recent Native American individual. For a moment, he even suspected the bones might belong to a much later settler or trapper. Once radiocarbon dating made clear that the skeleton was actually ancient, that first visual impression became much harder to ignore. Part of the problem was the language used to describe it. The skull was said to show Caucasoid traits, which sounds more definitive than it really was. In forensic anthropology at the time, that term referred to cranial form, not a simple claim that the individual was European in the modern sense. Still, that nuance mostly vanished once the story reached the public. A technical description turned into a headline, and the headline was hard to resist. One of the oldest known skeletons in North America didn't seem, at least at first glance, to look Native American. That is probably where the misunderstanding deepened. Skull shape is not the same thing as ancestry, at least not in any clean or reliable way. Populations change over time. Ancient groups do not line up perfectly with modern labels. And visual comparison works best when the people being compared are relatively close in time and place, not separated by 9,000 years. In that sense, Kennewick Man may have seemed anomalous less because he truly contradicted the broader story, and more because the tools available in the late 1990s were not really designed for someone that old. Even so, uncertainty tends to invite larger claims. Once people heard that the skull looked European, the case started attracting theories about Atlantic migrations, lost peoples, even supposed links to Ice Age Europeans. Most of those ideas were speculative at best, and the supporting evidence was thin, but the case had already grown beyond a set of remains. It had become a test of whether appearance could outweigh archaeology, geography, and long-held memory. And for years, one crucial line of evidence was still missing: DNA. The mystery got stranger once researchers looked more carefully at the very feature that made Kennewick Man so controversial in the first place: his skull. Later craniometric studies did not place him neatly alongside modern Europeans. If anything, some of those analyses pointed elsewhere, suggesting possible similarities with what scholars called circum-Pacific groups, including the Ainu of Japan and Polynesians. That shifted the discussion quite a bit. If he was not clearly European, then what exactly were scientists picking up in the bones? Was this evidence of some outsider population, or just the remains of a very ancient American whose features reflected a population history that no longer survives in any obvious modern form? By that stage, even the language around the case had started to wobble. The more closely the skull was measured, the less secure the public narrative seemed. What had sounded, in headlines, like a simple revelation, now looked more like a cautionary tale about how easily physical features can be overinterpreted. A few explanations emerged, and each had something going for it. The simplest was that the morphology had been read too confidently from the start. Ancient skulls do not map neatly onto modern racial categories, especially when the gap is 8,000 or 9,000 years. Another possibility, a little more provocative, was that Kennewick Man belonged to an early population in the Americas that differed biologically from later Native American groups, perhaps a lineage that faded, mixed, or was absorbed over time. Then there was the broader theory. Maybe the peopling of the Americas was more complicated than the standard model suggested, involving multiple founding populations whose physical traits later shifted or blurred. None of those ideas was unreasonable. Still, none could really close the case. That is where the whole debate became less about appearance and more about method. Skull shape can hint at ancestry, but only indirectly. It is shaped by inheritance, yes, though also by drift, isolation, and the simple fact that ancient human variation was often wider than the categories later used to sort it. DNA tends to work on a different level. It can reveal lines of relatedness across thousands of years in ways morphology sometimes cannot. For a long time, Kennewick Man sat right between those two systems, the older language of bones and the newer language of genomes. On the surface, the skeletons seemed to suggest one thing. Geography, archaeology, and common sense suggested another. And that, I think, is what made the case so gripping. It was never just about one skull. It was about whether the past is better read from what a body looks like, or from what it still carries inside it. When researchers finally recovered usable DNA from a hand bone, the mystery did not vanish. If anything, it became more precise, because at last, the bones had a way to answer for themselves. The turning point came in 2015, when a team led by Eska Willerslev managed to sequence Kennewick Man's genome from a small bone in the hand and compare it with both ancient and living populations. In a way, this was the evidence the whole case had been waiting on. For nearly 2 decades, people had argued over what the skull seemed to look like. Now, the focus shifted from outward appearance to inherited ancestry. And the result was fairly clear. The DNA indicated that Kennewick Man was more closely related to Native Americans than to any other group included in the analysis. Not European, not Polynesian, not some mysterious Old World population that had slipped into North America and vanished. That matters, because it suggests the earlier confusion came less from the man himself than from the limits of the methods used to classify him. What I find interesting is that the DNA did not simply solve the case and send everyone home. It exposed a deeper problem. Kennewick Man appeared unusual, partly because researchers were comparing a very ancient individual to much later populations and expecting the fit to be cleaner than it could realistically be. The mismatch was real enough, but the explanation attached to it seems to have been off. Rather than pointing to a forgotten European migration, the skull may have reflected something easier to miss. Early Native American populations were probably more physically varied than older anthropological categories allowed for. That is the part a lot of retellings flatten out. DNA did not shrink the mystery. If anything, it refined it. It showed that a person could be genetically connected to Native American ancestry, while still looking, to modern observers, somewhat unexpected. In that sense, the real issue was never a lost Atlantic crossing or a hidden colony from Europe. It was the gap between two types of evidence. Bones can hint, sometimes usefully, sometimes misleadingly. Genetics can trace relatedness more directly, though even that comes with caveats. So, Kennewick Man was not proof that Europeans reached the Americas first. He was, perhaps, evidence of something more awkward and more interesting. That ancient human diversity does not always line up with the labels people later invented. I keep coming back to that. A skeleton lies buried for nearly 9,000 years, and the real disruption comes not from where he came from, but from how quickly modern observers thought they recognized him. The Ancient One did not uncover a European America before Native America. He showed how uncertain our categories become when the past is older than the words we use to organize it. What happened next can get lost if the story is told only as a scientific course correction. Once the genome results came out, the main question was no longer whether the Ancient One stood outside the history of North America. That part, for the most part, had shifted. The harder question was what follows when science arrives, somewhat belatedly, at a conclusion that many Native communities had been asserting for years. After the DNA evidence showed that the Ancient One was more closely related to modern Native Americans than to any other population tested, the process of repatriation moved forward. In February 2017, his remains were returned to the tribes, who identified him as an ancestor, and were reburied in a private ceremony. That detail matters. The story did not end with a journal article, a lab report, or a press conference. It ended with people taking someone home. That is part of why Kennewick Man was never just a scientific puzzle. He became, maybe unfairly, a kind of mirror for modern habits of thought. Researchers looked at a face and tried to sort it, using categories that were developed much later and, in hindsight, may have been too rigid for someone this ancient. The public heard one technical term and turned it into a broader argument about race, origin, and ownership. Before long, whole theories were hanging on an impression that DNA would later complicate, if not undo. I do not think the lesson here is that science failed. It is closer to the opposite. Science, at its best, improves when it admits where its earlier tools were not enough. The sequencing of the genome mattered, of course, but maybe the deeper shift was more uncomfortable than that. It suggested that the past does not fit neatly into the boxes we like to keep ready. Ancient people may not look the way we expect them to look, and once we insist that they must, We start bending history around our assumptions. What stays with me is how odd that must feel in practice. You recover the remains of a man who lived nearly 9,000 years ago, and in the end, the most revealing thing is not where his face seemed to point, but how easily that face invited projection. A narrow skull, an unfamiliar profile, a few confident comparisons, and suddenly the story drifts. Kennewick. Man seems to force a more unsettling possibility on us. Maybe the biggest obstacle to understanding the ancient world is not missing evidence, but the certainty we bring with us when we first look. That is why the case still matters. Not because it proved Europeans reached America first. It did not. But because it showed how much older, messier, and less obedient to our labels human history can be than we would sometimes like.